the third point is precisely, I think, that we think that there is an ontological or metaphysical or philosophical question which must be recognized and developed after Lacan in the philosophical field. These 3 points are of very, very important, and it is why we are here today.
I totally agree with you. I would just like to supplement it that maybe there is another. First, I would like to emphasize this final point. We both share the conviction that hopefully the era of so-called discourse analysis, where every fundamental ontological, even metaphysical question can be reduced to the question of historical discursive conditions. For example, for a typical Foucauldian, if you tell him, does a man have an immortal soul? He will immediately transform it into the question, under what discursive regime can you even ask this question? No? Simply, in a naive sense, how it touches the real and so on becomes totally irrelevant. The question is, under what discursive regime can you talk about this, and so on and so on. This is one thing we share. Another thing we both absolutely share is that we reject the topic of finitude as the ultimate horizon. We notice, both of us, the strange reversal with regard to 19th century, where usually infinity was the spiritual infinity idealism, finitude was concrete being materialism. Today, it's almost the opposite. Obscurantism and spiritualism today are supported by the topic of finitude. It's by saying, no, we are finite, fragile, and so on, that you open up an empty space where all the ghosts of spiritualism can dwell, and so on and so on. So that would be another feature. But to answer you directly, yes, the question is, because, you know, Lacan, of course, and this is the Lacan that I really hate, I'm ready to admit. The Lacan that I detect in what you quoted, it's the most arrogant Lacan. It's like, I'm unique and great, but there will be in the future ordinary men who will try to drag me back into... That's where I violently disagree with Lacan. I think the true greatness is to accept it. And, you know, I remain here purely a philosopher, radically, in the sense of, you know, whenever somebody says, I leave behind ontology and so on, if you read him closely, you discover traces of a non-reflected, usually very bad ontology. So what I would say, the fundamental category I'm struggling with here is this idea, which unfortunately was elaborated even in some Gnostic tradition. Of course, I don't want to do that. This idea of unfinished reality, in the sense of, in this sense, we should abandon ontology only in the sense if by ontology we think of pure positively constituted reality. And I think the way I read also your point about original multiplicity, it's precisely as you emphasize, it's not a multiplicity composed of ones. It's a multiplicity which is a radical multiplicity. You cannot come to the end and they say, five. So this idea of and here I follow even Meillassoux, although again, then immediately I take a different path. This idea of how what we misperceive as the limitation of our knowledge, not limitation in the sense of finitude, but incompleteness, should be immediately ontologized into incompleteness of reality itself. This is how I would have read I try to do it now in a materialist way, outside all the bullshit about how our mind creates reality, the lesson of quantum physics. This terrible lesson that really, in itself, things are not fully constituted. In this sense, I am against the ontology, this full positive ontology, which I find, in spite of all my admiration for Lenin, for example, in Lenin's materialism and empirical-criticism, where the problem becomes, are there really things outside there fully existing? And this asymptotic, I think what we share is total opposition to this asymptotic notion of truth. There is full reality out there. We gradually but never perfectly approach it. Where? No wonder you know who admired deeply materialism and empiriocriticism. A ferocious anti-communist, if there ever was one, Karl Popper. You notice that. In spite of all his criticism, he says, but material empiriocriticism, Lenin is excellent there. No, I claim he is not. But nonetheless, to play the bad guy, I totally agree with you that the problem is with these different forms of negativity. Now, playing a bad guy, maybe here there is some difference between the two of us. Where you say multiplicity and void, I would try to read maybe more of some kind of negativity, which I take from Hegel into this void. Because I know you don't mean it in this way, but my primordial fear is that, I'm not saying you do, but some people do, namely is to reading this multiplicity and void into a kind of Orientalist Buddhist position, multiplicity of phenomena against the background of void as a kind of a zero primordial abyss and so on. That's not the void which is my void. My void is more of an obstacle, failure, catastrophe. It's a more violent, dynamic void. But these are absolutely fundamental questions. We cannot do it now.
No.
Yeah, you have it there. Go.
I want to ask a further question about the link between ontology and freedom, which in this case, in the context of talking about Lacan's anti-philosophy, we could link to the act. Now, Alain, in your work, for instance, in your seminar on the anti-philosophy of Lacan from the mid-90s, you talk about the act and how Lacan treats it as quite central to marking him out as an anti-philosopher. But here, Slavoj had his own way of bringing you into proximity of anti-philosophy. I think on this issue, it's possible to do so by pointing out that where one would least expect it, that is, at the very start of being an event, your magnum opus, that there is this sort of what one could call an act as this radical decision, where confronted with the Platonic Parmenidean question, being one or many, which one could say for you, in the terms of logics of worlds, is a point that any and every philosopher must confront, where there's a yes or no choice to be made, and one has to commit. You wager, in the form of the axiom, the one is not. But that is a decision which, as you indicate there, cannot be grounded by appeal to some sort of guiding intuitions or some meta level vouching for the choice one way or the other. And this might be Sartre's shadow still in the background in terms of him as one of your three masters in 20th century French thought. It seems as though it's that justifies choosing the one particular branch of pure mathematics that you choose. What justifies Zermelo Fraenkel plus the axiom of choice amongst other axiomatizations of set theory, and what even makes set theory privileged versus other branches of mathematics. It seems as though it's that ZFC is the only mathematical discourse that is truly oneless, or that tries to formalize an ontology without ones. So it seems as though the choice comes first, the decision, the pure decision, the act of wagering on the many in the form of the one is not versus the one, that even gets your own ontology off the ground. And given that for you ontology although it's mathematical, this is very much the concern of philosophy as a kind of meta-ontology. It would seem as though you're once again back in proximity with anti-philosophy in terms of there being this radical, ungrounded gesture, this decision in the face of a kind of ontological point, that's your act that literally sets up the very architecture of being an event. And I'm wondering how you and then maybe
À peu près, oui, mais tu me redis quand même.
Non, non, quand même, l'idée c'est que au début de l'être événement,
Oui.
comme tu fais choix d'une certaine ontologie,
Oui, oui.
d'une certaine
J'ai compris,
logique,
oui,
des ensembles, etc., est-ce que c'est pas quand même, comme dans l'antiphilosophie, ton choix fondamental, existentiel, acte de liberté?
The point is to return to my goal in philosophy. Why philosophy is for me something interesting. Finally, there is always something like that in every biography of a philosopher. And for me, the question of philosophy is the question of novelty, of creation, of how something new is possible in the world. Something which is not reducible to the repetition. In fact, I name repetition all the structures of the world as it is, all the inertia of the world. Okay. So, is there something which interrupts repetition? And what are the general conditions of that sort of interruption? And naturally, behind all that, we have the condition of the creation of a new trend in artistic creation, political revolution, love encounter, and so on, a new theory. All that are the concrete forms of novelty. So, you know, my problem is not the existence of something new, because for me it's a fact. There has been and there exists something new. There exists a great love, patience, artistic creations, scientific theory, and political revolutions. So my question is not the existence of novelty, but how something like that is possible, and how we can have a thinking of novelty. So it's a properly philosophical question, which comes, like Hegel says, after the truth. The truth exists, and the philosophical question comes in the evening, in the evening of the day of truth. So I accept this judgment. And to answer this question, how something new is possible, how we are not under the laws of repetition, we are not absolutely under the laws of repetition, I must propose an ontological framework. Because without an ontological framework, we cannot understand what is new, precisely. What is new, we must construct an ontology of repetition, precisely, of the universe of being as it is. And my decision concerning this ontology is not of the decision to take mathematics. The decision was that an ontology which is not a theological ontology, which is not under the potency of the one. That is my question. What is an ontology which is not under the potency of the one? I agree with Heidegger on this point. In a